Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael. I wanted to, on a Thursday here, go over a video clip that I just came across from the papal liturgy of the funeral of Benedict the 16th, memory eternal. There was a clip that is being circulated right now that I really do think should be commented upon. However, I hope to see some measured and reasonable comments on it. I fear that maybe that's not what we're going to get. Um, but if you're not familiar with what I'm referring to, during the liturgy, whenever the Eucharist was being administered by various priests to the laity in the congregation, there's a clip which I'm going to show here in a moment where it seems as if again, it just seems, it appears that a priest denies Holy Communion to a communicant who I presume is a Catholic, and it seems like he did so, um, refused him communion because he wanted to receive kneeling on the tongue. Very, very tragic thing to see, him being denied communion because of this, if that is the reason. I ultimately don't know what the priest's reason was. It seems that they briefly have a just quick uh, exchange of words. I don't know if it came out that maybe the communicant wasn't Catholic and maybe that's why the priest denied him. I doubt that's what it is. It seems much more likely that the man presents himself kneeling and is denied for that reason. Again, I don't know that with certainty because there is something that is exchanged. But I doubt very seriously it's because maybe it came out that he's a non-Catholic, because most priests don't ask, for better or worse, most priests don't ask whenever you go to receive communion, "Are you Catholic?" They just don't. Again, maybe they should, but they usually don't, and I don't think that that's what is done here. Again, benefit of the doubt, maybe there's some kind of reason and excuse for this, but it sure seems like he is denied communion for simply kneeling and wanting to receive on the tongue. If that is the case, then that is a problem and that is wrong. And I do want to cover why that is wrong. However, I also want to say if this is the case, there's also a problem with the communicant, and I will demonstrate that here in a moment. So I would then indicate if that is the case, both the priest and the communicant did wrong here. However, I may say that I think the graver fault lies with the priest. But since I don't know their specific situation, I'm not going to comment on these two individuals, the priest and the communicant. I don't know their situation. I don't know what was said. I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt. But what I will do is comment on if this is the case, here's my thoughts. And since this actually does happen, um, here's the problem with it whenever it does happen. And I've personally been refused Holy Communion for similar situations. I was by one priest suspended from communion for 6 months simply because I wanted to receive communion from a priest and preferred, not refused, but preferred to receive from a priest rather than a female extraordinary minister of communion, a Holy Communion. I did not refuse, and I would not refuse, but I prefer to receive from a priest, and I think that that is perfectly fine. But unfortunately, because I had that preference and have that preference still, I was suspended from Holy Communion by a Roman Rite priest for 6 months. Well, since he actually has zero jurisdiction there, and there's no um, that's not a legitimate penalty that he could impose on me for that preference. I just completely ignored it and went to a different priest because that priest has absolutely zero authority to impose such a discipline. I just completely ignored that. If it were a legitimate discipline, I would submit myself to the church, but that's not legitimate. That's an abuse of power. Um, so I just ignored it. So I've been in similar situations where I've been denied Holy Communion because I just am doing, the traditional thing. So I get it, but I do think that for communicants, um, who walk away from the Eucharist because they will not receive on the hand, I do have some comments about that as well. Let me show you the clip so you have better reference of what I'm referring to. Again, I don't know their particular situation, neither the communicant nor the priest. I presume the communicant is a Catholic, and perhaps this priest has some kind of reason for why he denied Holy Communion other than the man knelt and wanted to receive on the tongue. Perhaps. I think it's unlikely. I think it's much more likely that he denied him for simply wanting to receive kneeling and on the tongue. But let's watch it. All right. Let me rewind that right here. Now, notice this. There's I don't see him saying anything, so I don't see him maybe saying like, "Oh, I'm an Anglican" or something like that. And again, how likely would that be for one to even say that, right? So the priest, however, I do see him saying something, and I think it's likely that he's saying, "No, you have to receive." Standing up on the hand or something like that. I don't know for sure, but that's the way it comes across. Watch. Again, it looks that way. Maybe there's some kind of excuse here. Maybe, but it just seems incredibly unlikely. One more time. And notice he kisses his hand. And that's good. That's good. You know what? If a priest sins against you, you know what? I'm glad that he showed that kind of response on that point. If this priest did deny him communion for that reason, that would be a sin against the communicant, and that would be a good response. However, I do have a problem with him walking away from the Eucharist here, which I'll discuss here in a moment. But the greater problem is a refusal to give the communicant the body of Christ, presumably, seemingly, for the reason of kneeling and wanting to receive on the tongue. If that is the case, I'll restrict myself to speaking about this in general or for whenever this does happen and suspend judgment on the priest himself. But if a priest were to refuse Holy Communion to a communicant simply because they prefer to receive kneeling down and on the tongue, I would say that priest engaged in sin. That would be immoral on part of the priest. That would be sinful behavior. I could never imagine, if I were a priest, refusing the body and blood of Christ to a communicant over a particular form of reception. I could never imagine standing in the way of a person and Christ Jesus over a matter like that. I could never imagine that. Now, I understand that maybe a priest refuses communion to a communicant because they're in grave sin and the priest knows it or something. That's fine. That's biblical. That's 1 Corinthians 11 right there. Sure, of course. But over a particular mode of reception, I don't see that as being anything other than sinful behavior and immorality on part of any priest who would aggregate such power unto themselves as to think that they could deny Christ because of the mode of reception. So I think in cases where priests do that, I'm not speaking on this particular priest because I don't know the situation for sure, so I can't speak on him, but I can just speak in general. For a priest that would do that, it really does seem that is incredibly immoral behavior. I would also say it's illicit. It's not allowed by the church itself, with one exception, which I'll mention here in a moment. The church itself says that a person cannot be denied Holy Communion simply because they want to receive kneeling. That is not a legitimate reason to deny somebody Holy Communion. I want to point your attention to Redemptionis Sacramentum. Redemptionis Sacramentum, I believe is the name of the document. Let me look at it again. It's been a while since I've looked at it. Yeah, Redemptionis Sacramentum by the CD or the Congregation for Divine Worship and Discipline of the Sacrament. Now it's the Dicastery. Keep changing names here. This is from paragraph 91, and I am going to talk about an exception to this here in a moment, but let's present the general rule first. Okay, so in distributing Holy Communion, it is to be remembered that sacred ministers may not deny the sacraments to those who seek them in a reasonable manner and are rightly disposed. That is, they're in a state of grace and are not prohibited by law from receiving them. You know, there's no kind of canonical penalties on them. Hence, any baptized Catholic who is not prevented by law must be admitted to Holy Communion. By the way, how does this work out for Roman Rite priests who deny communion to chrismated infants of Eastern Catholic parents? Just throwing that one out there, since that has happened to me. Some Roman Rite priests refusing to give communion to my infant. Well, no longer infant, he's 4 now, but he's been fully initiated. So anyways, that's a whole separate problem that I've noticed with some Roman Rite priests, not all. Hence, any unbaptized Catholic who is not prohibited by law must be admitted to Holy Communion. Therefore, it is not licit, that is lawful. Laicity refers to what is lawful. It is not licit to deny Holy Communion to any of Christ's faithful solely on the grounds, for example, that the person wishes to receive the Eucharist kneeling or standing. Either way. You know, if you have a preference here, kneeling or standing, in the Eastern tradition, we stand. In the Western tradition, it tends to be kneeling, depending on what time period we're referring to. I suppose we're talking about right now, contemporary. Some people prefer kneeling, and also now in the Western tradition, some people are going back to and prefer standing. So there's kind of a mix there in the Roman Rite, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with having, you know, differences here. I think ultimately it's going to be the intention behind the standing or the kneeling. What is your intention behind it? But it would be illicit for a priest to deny someone Holy Communion simply because they prefer to receive kneeling or standing. It's more likely that priests are denying people for kneeling rather than standing, though. And that certainly seems to be the case in this video, but again, suspending judgment on the particular priest. Maybe there's something going on in that conversational exchange that would say, okay, well, now I understand. But I think that's incredibly unlikely for the reasons why I already mentioned. Now, there is an exception to this about refusal of communion for those who are kneeling. There is an exception. Take a look at this. This is from the Congregation of Divine Worship and Discipline of the Sacraments, November 2020. This was a letter written to an individual by the Archbishop's secretary, but posted publicly, and it references a circular letter by the Congregation for Divine Worship, written by Cardinal Sarah. Here's what it says. Yeah, Cactoid Jim, I'm about to address that here in a moment. He says, is it possible that priest serves in a diocese which still has COVID restrictions on communion? He could be obeying his bishop. I'll address that in a moment. That's where I'm going next. This Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments has received and attentively studied your petition, making recourse against the decision of Bishop Stika to suspend reception of Holy Communion on the tongue at public masses throughout the Diocese of Knoxville for the duration of the public health emergency caused by the coronavirus pandemic, as has already been enunciated in the circular letter of Robert Sarah of August the 15th, 2020, and approved for publication by His Holiness Pope Francis in times of difficulty, for example, wars or pandemics. Bishops and episcopal conferences can give provisional norms which must be obeyed, even clearly as in this case, to suspend for whatever time might be required. Reception of Holy Communion on the tongue at the public celebration of the Holy Mass. For your convenience, please find in attachment the full text of this letter. Now, note it's specifically talking about on the tongue rather than kneeling. Not exactly the same of what's going on in this video, but somewhat relevant because he was wanting to receive kneeling and on the tongue. So, in other words, the Congregation for Divine Worship is saying that during times of pandemic, it is within the realm of the Episcopal Conference and even the bishop to determine to restrict reception of Holy Communion to on the hand or on the tongue or whatever particular form. They have the ability to restrict it to one mode of reception. For better or worse, they do have that authority. Now, the question is that what is going on here? Is that what's going on here? I don't think so. I don't think that's what's going on for two reasons. Let me pull the video back up and explain why. 1 second here. Move it back over here. Okay, share my screen. First of all, none of them are using masks, so I don't think that we could say it's because of COVID. If it's because of COVID, first of all, how does on the hand make any sense anyway, since you're touching it? And what if the priest has COVID? I don't think it makes sense to restrict um, communion to reception on the hand because of COVID anyway. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Unless the priest is using like some kind of hand gloves or something. Doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Number two, that's clearly not the case. None of them are wearing masks. It's not because of the pandemic. The other question is it because his bishop has COVID restrictions? That would apply in his diocese, right? But this priest is not in his diocese unless he's part of the Diocese of Rome. He's in Rome, right? So it actually depends on ultimately Rome's discipline. And I'm not aware that Rome is currently restricting things to on the hand and standing. I'm not aware of that. So that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense to me. But again, I can't judge this priest specifically because I don't know what was said in that exchange and if there's some information that I'm missing. But I do know how it looks. And it doesn't look good. And if it's the case that he was denied simply for that reason, that would be not only immoral, it would also be illicit. And I don't think that it can be backed by the COVID exception. Now, this does raise then the question, can the church restrict modes of reception to just, one particular form during times of pandemic? Yeah, it can. Should it is a different question, but it can certainly. You'll notice in this video, he was only presented the Eucharist under one kind. He wasn't given the opportunity to receive the chalice. He's given it under one kind. Now, it's the apostolic practice to receive under both kinds. Now, if you receive under one kind, do you receive the full body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus because he's in every particle? Absolutely. Sure. Of course. So you still receive the whole Christ, but it is the apostolic practice to be given communion under both kinds. And that was a long-standing and venerable tradition and practice going back to Jesus himself and the apostles. The church, however, in the Roman Rite, decided to restrict reception to one kind after a very long period of time of giving both kinds. And the question then is, okay, well, did the church have the authority to depart from apostolic practice here? Yes, the church did. And it had a reason. And the reason was some people maintain the heresy that unless you receive under both kinds, you don't receive the full body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. So in order to combat that problem, the church took the measure of, okay, we're going to make you receive only under one kind. Might we say, you know what, there may have been a better way to handle that? Sure. But is that completely immoral of the church to do? No. Is it legitimate? Does the church have that authority? Yes, it does. And you'll even notice that even now, although the chalice has been restored to the laity since the time of the Second Vatican Council, it's still common to see reception under only one kind, as this individual was going to be receiving. So, if the church can modify an apostolic practice in restricting reception to only one kind, it can certainly modify apostolic practice from communion on the hand to communion on the tongue, or to mandate the apostolic practice of communion on the hand only. It can do that. Should it is a different question, but it can. No individual priest, however, can do that. No individual priest has that authority to make those decisions. The church as a whole can make that decision. If that's universally promulgated, the church can do that. But no individual priest can say, I'm going to restrict things to you have to receive in this particular way, and that's it. No priest has that authority. The church does, but the priest doesn't. And again, should the church do those things? Well, it's debated, right? It's a prudential question. The church obviously thought it was prudential to depart from the apostolic practice of communion on the hand and to start to do communion kneeling on the tongue in the Roman rite. And that's fine. It had reasons for that. That's fine. The church also then, in the post-conciliar era, said that it is going to try to get back to the apostolic practice of communion on the hand. We might argue that hasn't been done very well. That's my position. But that certainly was one of the intentions and motives, was to get back to an apostolic practice. Might we say there were some other motives? Sure. Might we say it was poorly executed and is being poorly executed? Sure. But you're starting to see in the post-conciliar era the church trying to get away from some of these medieval practices and accretions. I don't necessarily think they're bad. I'll go to bat for the Roman Rite and defend Roman Rite Catholics over and against Eastern Orthodox, who will decry all this stuff and say Roman Rite Catholics are ridiculous for restricting under one kind or receiving kneeling. I'll go to bat for the Roman Rite Catholics. So does the church have the authority eventually to say you can only receive on the hand, you can't receive on the tongue? Yes, but that isn't what the church has done, and so no priest has the authority to do this, as we saw from the Congregation for Divine Worship. Now, let me also make a note here about the communicant who would walk away from Christ because they can't receive kneeling on the tongue. Although I think the worse fault, the grave, what's the proper term here? The graver fault? Yeah, is that the right one? The biggest issue here is going to be a priest who refuses to give Holy Communion to a communicant because of a particular form or mode of reception. That's a problem, and that's the biggest problem, in my opinion. However, I don't think that a communicant who walks away in this situation and does not receive the body of Christ because they can't receive in a particular form, I don't think that they're without fault. I can't imagine being a priest and not giving communion to an individual because they want to receive on the tongue only. I can't imagine denying Christ to them. I also can't imagine not receiving the body and blood of Christ because I want to receive in a particular way. I also can't imagine that. I can't imagine being this communicant who presumably walks away from the Eucharist because he can't receive kneeling. So because you're required, perhaps illicitly, by this priest to receive on the hand, you walk away from Christ. I don't understand that either. Reception on the hand is the apostolic practice and the dominant and venerable practice of the first millennium. Both East and West have tended to depart from that practice in the second millennium, with either communion kneeling and on the tongue or communion on a liturgical spoon. So both traditions kind of departed from the apostolic practice for one reason or another, and I think legitimately so. It's not something that was wrong. But it's also not wrong to receive communion in the way that the vast majority of Christians in the first millennium received, which was on hand. And I know there was various ways in which it was done, but it was just that there were various ways in which it was done. It was not always done with on a cloth or something like that. That was actually pretty rare, and it was generally limited to women who would receive on a cloth in their hand. But that's a different matter. I could never walk away from Christ in the Eucharist because of a particular mode. If somebody said that I have to receive kneeling, I would do it, even though they can't restrict me to that. I would still rather receive Christ than walk away from them. Likewise, if they say you have to receive in your hand, though they can't do that, no individual priest can do that, I would never walk away from Christ because of that. How can we imagine walking away from Christ and walking away from that grace because of a particular form of reception? That seems very pharisaical. Matthew Smith said, I wouldn't if my hands were dirty, which may have been the case. I don't know. I mean, maybe the guy's hands were dirty. And if you're going to receive in the hand, I certainly think that your hands need to be clean, right? Certainly. I mean, be as respectful as possible and also be attentive to any particles that remain on your hand, because I have noticed that in times where I've received on the hand, I've noticed that there's still particles on my hand after receiving communion. Be attentive to that and receive that. Do the best that you can to be respectful, but don't get too pharisaical and legalistic to the point that you say, even with clean hands, I can't touch the Eucharist, because again, number one, you're departing from apostolic practice and becoming too pharisaical. At that, and then second of all, um, you'll never be entirely clean. Your throat is not entirely clean, right? Your digestive system's not entirely clean. So don't get too pharisaical with it. And yeah, I'm aware of what Aquinas said, but Aquinas also said some things that he was wrong on. Aquinas also thought infants shouldn't be given Holy Communion. Didn't see any reason for it, and that's a departure from the apostolic practice where infants were also given Holy Communion. So I wouldn't necessarily go to Aquinas as the best person to go to when it comes to discipline on how to receive the sacraments, since he was wrong on that matter. So again, I think that there's a fault for both priests who deny communion to such communicants and then communicants who walk away. I think both of them are wrong in such cases. Again, I don't know their specific situation, so I can't comment on those two individuals in that video, but I can speak about this in general. Hope this helps. Somebody said maybe he went to another priest to receive the Eucharist. Maybe. I wouldn't have walked away from the priest. I would have just received under whatever kind that the priest was illicitly requiring me to receive under, or whatever mode I should say. But maybe he did go and receive Christ from another one of the priests. Hopefully, at the very least, he did that. At the very least, I hope. I sure hope he didn't walk away from a liturgy where Christ is presented to him and he doesn't want to receive because of a particular form or mode of reception. That is pharisaicalism at its worst, in my opinion. You rob yourself of grace because of some technicality that isn't even apostolic to begin with. It isn't even traditional to begin with. Communion on the tongue is not traditional. Communion while kneeling is not necessarily the apostolic or universal practice. I don't have a problem with that tradition, but it's not the ultimate or ancient or apostolic tradition, I should say. I think that there is, however, nothing wrong with in the Roman Rite having altered that apostolic practice and having imposed communion under one kind only, or on the tongue, or kneeling. That's fine, and I think that there were good reasons for why that happened historically in the Roman Rite. Which again, I'll go to bat for the Roman Rite Catholics and defend them on that against Eastern Orthodox, some of which will criticize the Roman Rite for these departures. And I'll just turn back around and say, well, in the East, there's all kinds of departures from apostolic practice, all kinds. The ordinary minister of confirmation in the Eastern tradition is not the bishop anymore, right? And that's the apostolic practice. It's for it to be the bishop. And in the Eastern rites, they tend to receive on a liturgical spoon, and yet that's certainly departure from apostolic practice. It's also against Canon 101 from Trullo. And so um we in the East have our departures from apostolic practice as well. And so I just simply point those out and say, well, look, I mean, you can't criticize Roman Rite Catholics for departures in areas that are similar to departures in the Eastern tradition. So anyways, like I said, I hope this helps. And I look forward to hearing other people's commentary on this issue. I just hope that it is respectful and mindful of the various factors that I tried to account for here. Anyways, hope y'all enjoy this. Hit that like button and the subscribe button. See you later. God bless.
Merry Christmas, everybody. I started this channel in January of 2019. So I've been doing this show for roughly 4 years. And in the month of April, I was fortunate enough to be able to do the show full-time instead of part-time. So I transitioned to a full-time show in the month of April thanks to all of the subscribers, the patrons, and the channel members. So I want to personally thank y'all for making that possible. So I have some exciting news for the month of January here in 2023. I was fortunate enough to have a donor bless me with the funds for 1 month to hire a marketing team to help this channel grow. Now, this marketing team is going to grab some select highlight clips and YouTube shorts, and that will help reach a larger audience because, frankly, most people don't have the time to watch an hour or 2-hour video by yours truly. So, doing highlight clips and YouTube shorts, that's much more likely to reach a newer audience and help this channel grow. Now, this donor has paid for me to do this for a month. However, if you like what this channel is doing and you want to see it continue to grow, and you think I'm producing good content that really needs to reach people, perhaps you think that I'm helping Eastern Orthodox come into communion with the Catholic Church, or helping Protestants see their need for communion with the Catholic Church, or perhaps you think that I'm helping bring some reason to Catholics who are already in the church but are struggling with the present crisis. Perhaps you think that that needs to reach a new audience and will help bring some hope and reason to various people. If you do, and if you have benefited from this channel, I ask that you would consider supporting me on Patreon. It's going to be patreon.com/reason and theology. You'll go straight there and you'll see various plans that you can support me at and also get additional content and benefits. I am going to need your support if you would like to see this channel grow continuing after the month of January. If you would like to see me continue to aggressively market this channel and reach new people, please consider supporting me. Patreon.com/reason and theology. If you think this content has benefited souls, whether they are Catholics, Orthodox, or Protestants, certainly check out one of those plans there. You'll also, of course, get access to extra content. And for those who sign up at the $25 level, I will call you on Zoom and we'll have a personal conversation together, and we'll just chat about whatever you would like. And so that will be one additional benefit that comes with supporting me at that level. But once again, if I can get at least 200 patrons to sign up and support me, I can continue to grow this channel after the month of January with a continued strategy in marketing. So certainly consider supporting me. Patreon.com/reason and theology if you feel that I'm producing content that needs to reach a new audience with a message of hope for people who are confused in this time of crisis within the Catholic Church, and also to reach a non-Catholic audience to tell them of their need to join in the one Church of Christ that is the Catholic Church. All right, thank you for considering this, and I covet your prayers. God bless.